Hello, this is Brian Zanti with the Turing School of Software and Design. And today we're going to be exploring cookies and sessions. What we did yesterday in class was we created this simple app that would allow someone to register as a user, log in and log out. But what we want to do now is kind of dig a little bit deeper into how we're managing that login, log out functionality. So if we look at the code on the screen here, what we'll see is our sessions controller create action. So a session is this idea of a website tracking what a user is doing. So a session create, we can think of that as our login. So once someone logs in, we are now tracking who they are and what they are doing on the site. So the way that we do that is so when this create action is running, someone has submitted to us a username and password to log in. So we're going to say find the user based on the username that they give us. And then on line 7 here, we're going to check that username matches the password that we have stored for that user. And under the hood, it's also hashing that password because we don't want to store plain text passwords. So we're going to check their username and a password. If those credentials are good, then we're going to run this line 9 here. So we're going to store in our session a key value pair of user ID matching that user's ID. And that ID is this Rails primary key that Active Record automatically assigns to us. So nothing special that we haven't seen before about this ID column. It's just now that we're storing it in this session. So let's go through this process and kind of see what this looks like. So we'll go to localhost 3000. We'll create our user account. So I'll make Brian, password of Brian. And then we will click, I already have an account. So that right there created the user and assigned it that primary key. So now I'm going to log in with that same username password combo. And now we'll see it says welcome, Brian. And now instead of register or log in, it says log out. And every time I click refresh up here, it'll continue to remember who I am. We can see that it still says log out here. So that's indicating the website still remembers that who I am and that I've logged in. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my Chrome developer tools and open up this application tab at the top here. If you have your developer tool set up a different way, you might not see it. You might have to click this arrow here to find this application tab. Once you find this application tab, on the left here, we'll see storage, cookies, and then our localhost 3000. So this is what our app has stored in the cookie. And we can see this Congress tracker session right here. So this Congress tracker session, we can see the value here is just this real long gibberish. We can't really read it. And that's good that it is that way for security reasons. But it doesn't really show us much of how this is working under the hood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to my code here, and I'm going to change this from session to cookies. But before I do that, I do want to log out. So let me click log out here. So I'm going to change this from session to cookies. And then what I'm also going to need to do is go over to my application controller and find this method where we're finding the current user, change that also to cookies. So when the user logs in, we were storing their user ID in the session. Now we're storing it in the cookies. And when we're trying to check who the currently logged in user is, we're going to look in those same cookies. So let's go through this process one more time. I'm going to delete this Congress tracker session cookie just so it's not going to get in our way. And I'm going to log in again. So I already have an account. I'm going to log in Brian. Oh, and that session popped up anyway. That's okay. But now what we can see here is another cookie with user ID is 1. So this is the plain text version of this gibberish cookie that we have stored up here. So the point of doing this is so that we can see what the actual data is stored on my web browser. So the fact that I can view this in the Chrome Developer Tools, that indicates that this is data that is stored on this web browser. Another way of saying that is that this is data that is stored client side. So my web browser is tracking this user ID and this value of 1. So this value is that primary key that was automatically assigned to me when I registered my user. If I go over to my Rails console and I do user.all, I'll see that that ID of 1 matches this ID that I see if I directly access my database from my Rails console. And we can indeed see that this is the username of Brian. So this demonstrates the plain version of what data we are storing. So session, this idea of tracking a user on a website, we have used cookies in this version to implement a session. We have used cookies to track who this currently logged in user is. Some other things that we could do with cookies, just to demonstrate how this works. So we can set this cookie right here. We could do some other things here. So these cookies are smart. So we can say something like store the value of this user ID and set an expiration date. So Rails gives us some sort of default expiration date. You'll notice if we look over here in the Chrome Developer Tools, there's also an expires value for our cookies. We can change that expires value right here in our code. So we could say expires, let's say expires 10 seconds. So what this will mean is that when someone logs in, their login will only be good for 10 seconds. So I'm going to delete this cookie right here. The logout functionality won't work unless I delete that. So that's why I did that. So I'm going to say I already have an account. So I'm going to log in again here with my Brian user. And we'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now we're logged out. So my counting wasn't exactly aligned, but after 10 seconds, my user was logged out. If we do that again, you can start counting, but then we can also see that the expires value is set to a specific timestamp. So that's telling the browser when it should stop storing this cookie. So I think I've been talking for about 10 seconds. Now we can see that that cookie was automatically deleted. I did not have to delete it. So these cookies can be expired like that. That's one thing we can do. Let me demonstrate also. So let's take out this expiration. Let's change this to 10 days. So we can expire this cookie at 10 days. So we'll log in here. And we'll see that this is now set to 7/17. Today's date is July 7th. So this is expiring 10 days from now. When I click logout, however, logout is not necessarily working. So let's go fix that. So this is in our sessions destroy, where we're setting this user ID to nil. Now we're using cookies. So we'll say cookies user ID should equal nil. So now let's try that. But this won't exactly work because if we set the user ID to nil, when we try to find that user, it's not going to work. So what we're going to have to do is rather than saying cookies user ID equals nil, change this to cookies.delete user ID. So rather than saying we want a nil value for user ID, this is saying we don't want a user ID at all in the cookies. So that's how we would have to refactor that. So we're going to have to manually delete this first time. log in again as Brian. Username, password, I think I mistyped something. There we go. Don't add to LastPass, click log out. And now we can see that user ID cookie disappears and we successfully logged out. So that was a quick refactor we had to make for the logout functionality here. Yeah, and it looks like it's working well now. So this cookies version here is just a plain cookie, and we can see that that cookie, when we log in, just gets stored as plain text in the user's browser, or it gets stored as plain text client side is another way to say that. I can also, rather than cookies, change this to cookies.signed. And then I would want to do the same thing in my application controller as well. So when we're looking for the logged in user, we want to look in our signed cookies. So what signed cookies are they give some sort of unique identifier to the cookie to make it so that the user cannot tamper with them. So this makes it, they make them non-writable is another way to say that. So yeah, if I register again, so notice how it sees me as logged out, because now we're not using the regular cookies, we're now using signed cookies. So click I already have an account, log in as Brian, and see how this user ID currently is stored with a value of just 1, that's plain text. Now when I log in, it will be stored with some more what looks like gibberish here. So there's a unique signature on this cookie which prevents me from tampering with it. So I can refresh the page right here. My browser still says log out, so it remembers who I am. As soon as I change this cookie at all, so let's, I think if I double click right here, I can change the value of this cookie. So if I say this is, let's just say different value here to illustrate I've totally changed it. Now when I refresh this page, the Rails does not recognize this as a valid cookie. So when we use cookies.signed like this, our cookies have to be untampered with. They cannot be changed. If we go back to our other version, so we'll take out .signed from all this code. And yeah, we're gonna have to manually delete this cookie again. And we log in again. So now that we're not using the signed version, we see this plain text value here. A big issue with this is that this is not tamper-proof. So if I just change this to user ID 2, this would totally work, assuming there was a user with ID 2, but there isn't right here. So let's go make another user. So let's go back to the, let's delete this cookie. Let's register another user. Let's make Meg. And so now when I log in as Meg, we'll see we'll see a different cookie appear here. So now we see user ID of 2. So this is the primary key for that second user that I just made. So now I am identifying myself as a completely different user. So the issue with just using these plain text cookies is that I could come in here, change it to 1, and refresh this page and see how it still says I'm logged in here. We could do something like, just to demonstrate this, let's put in our welcome index. Let's say, let's show a link to log out, and let's show logged in as, and then whatever that user's name is. So now when I refresh, it should say logged in as Brian. So I could just change this to user 2, and all of a sudden I'm logged in as Meg. So if this cookie right here is my ID card, this is me like crossing out the name and writing in a completely different name for that ID card. So this is why having signed cookies is a good idea. So signing a cookie prevents the user from tampering with it. So I'll change this back to cookies.signed and change this one also to cookies.signed. We'll log out, we'll log in again, and we'll log in as Meg. And so if I tried to change this cookie, let's just change one single character here. Let's change this trying to edit it here. Edit value. If I change this E to an A, now all of a sudden I'm logged out. So that's why signing cookies is important. So let me log in as Brian again. One thing that signing the cookie does not do, so it prevents a user from writing to it, but it does not prevent them from reading it. And you might say, well, I can't read this. This just looks like total gibberish to me. But it is, in fact, it is readable, and it's readable with a quick decode. So this is base 64 encoding. So if we go to look for a base 64 decoder, paste this value in here and click decode, we can see the actual what this is storing. So it's storing, looks like there's a key of Rails here, and then this looks like a hash message. Here's our message, and then here's our expiration date along with it. So the actual value is this MQ equals equals. And if we decode that in base 64, we can see that's our user ID of 1. And then if we did the same thing with the other user, we'll log in as Meg. Take that whole thing, decode it in base 64. Now we've got MG equals, decode that. That is our user ID of 2. So these values are still readable. You have to kind of know what you're doing and what encoding they're in, but they are still readable. So signing the cookies prevents a user from writing to it, but not reading it. So for full security, rather than signed cookies, what we want to use is encrypted cookies. So encrypted cookies prevents a user from reading the cookie and writing the cookie. So we'll go back over here, do this again. We'll log out, we'll log in as Brian. And I spelled encrypted wrong. Encrypted. There we go. Try that one more time. So we'll log in as Brian. So now we can see logged in as Brian right here. If we click on this value, and we try that same thing with the base 64 decode, that is not encoded in base 64. So there is another encryption algorithm that's used under the hood that is encrypting these cookies. So this is preventing me from reading it or writing it. So now let's try to write it. Let's change this to a 1 and then refresh. And we can see that I'm no longer logged in. So as soon as I tried to change it, Rails recognized that as an invalid cookie and just didn't use it. So that covers plain cookies, signed cookies, and encrypted cookies. But remember, what we're using under the hood is the Rails, what we were using at the very beginning was the Rails session. So let's change all of this back to session. And see the full process from the beginning. So click, I already have an account. Type in Brian here. Oh, and now that I'm storing Yeah. So now I don't have an expiration date for this. I can't use this version. So now I just want to store the plain user ID. So now that I'm using the Rails session, the expiration is controlled in a different way. So let me delete all of these cookies. I'll refresh my page here and just start from the beginning. So notice how it already created a session here, or created a cookie to track that session. And now when I log in, the value that is stored in this session changes, but it is still gibberish. I can't read it. So the way the Rails session works is it is using the encrypted cookies under the hood, and it is storing them all within one of these big, long dumps of just gibberish. So I'll say that I'll kind of summarize all of what we've talked about here. So sessions in general on the web are the idea of tracking what a user does. Rails implements that idea of sessions with this session object. So the general idea of a session and the Rails session object are two different things. The Rails session object makes sessions possible. Under the hood, the Rails session object uses encrypted cookies as the mechanism to make this happen. Now, Rails sessions, they can get complex. They can be stored server side or client side. You can configure a lot of options for them, such as their expiration. You can see here, this expiration just says session. So the control for that is actually happening server side. There's a lot of different things you can dig into with sessions, but the most important things are just what we've talked about. Cookies are stored client side. Cookies can be encrypted, and the Rails session uses encrypted cookies to keep all the session data secure. And that's about it for sessions and cookies. Thank you very much for your time.